Hi, everyone. Welcome to the May 29th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined very shortly by my usual co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to be handicapping some races from Kentucky and California. We'll begin at Churchill Downs, where we're going to talk about their late pick 5 sequence on Saturday. It's a pretty interesting group of races, actually bookended by the 2 stakes on that card, the winning colors for the sprinters and the mint julep, the last race on the card for the fillies on the turf. And then we'll end things by going out to California to talk about 2 stakes races, one from Santa Anita on Saturday, and also a race up at Golden Gate, a track we don't often talk about, but they've got an interesting stakes race there for the filly and mare turf sprinters also on Saturday. So, Craig, how are things going this weekend?
Going well here in Oklahoma. We have beautiful weather today, finally. It's been raining a lot, but it's cleared up, and just looking forward to this nice weekend of racing. Big fields everywhere, which we're growing accustomed to. I hope it lasts for a while, and I know this is probably the last weekend we're going to do without your NYRA tracks coming back, so things are certainly on the uptick for horse racing.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to getting back into the swing of things at NYRA. They're drawing, I believe, that first Wednesday card later today, so I'll be looking forward to diving into that later. But these Churchill Downs cards have definitely kept us busy. It seems like every Saturday, and really almost every day of the meet, but especially on the Saturdays, they really just have a stacked set of races, and these late pick 5 sequences have been really interesting. Hard to hit, but interesting races to talk about, and this one is definitely no different. It begins with the 7th race, going through the 11th. The 7th is that first stakes race. The winning colors, a grade 3 event for the fillies and mare sprinters, 6 furlongs on the dirt. And the big horse in this race is Mia Mischief. She got back on track last time. It was supposed to be that matchup between her and Bellafina in that carousel stakes. Bellafina didn't get the trip that day, didn't show up, and Mia Mischief got back to her best efforts and returned to some of the higher speed figures that she's run in her life. She seems like one of these horses that just runs as fast as she has to win these days.
Yeah, that was certainly impressive last time out. I know I was against her on our pace cast just because she hadn't been running particularly fast, but the way she blew that field away made me look pretty silly. But not just me, I'm sure there were others out there, but I took a stand against her, and I'm not sure that's something I want to do here. I do think there are 2 clear standouts on paper, and that would be Break Even and Mia Mischief. But of those 2, I prefer Mia Mischief, largely because of the post draw. I do think Break Even is going to clear early and get the lead, but there's not a ton of speed in here. And I think Mia Mischief's just going to get a nice trip sitting outside of her, and I think she's going to be able to finish the race off a little better. There are a couple others to probably talk about in here. Spice Perfection is only 7-2 on the morning line. She is a multiple graded stakes winner, but I'm not as big a fan of her. She hasn't been running particularly great lately. That one win she got in the Gopher Wand was just a really aberrant race with a super slow pace on a track that probably really favored the inside and speed. So if you take that race off, suddenly her PPs don't look that great. She hasn't been running slow. There's a barn change to deal with. So I'm against her among the lower price horses. A couple others that jumped out at me. Princess Causeway comes out of a big figure race last time at Gulfstream when she won an allowance race. But looking through the TimeformUS chart, that race has been pretty disappointing coming back. Not a whole lot of horses have run well out of that. So even at her longest price, I'm not too high on that one. The one horse, if I was going to include somebody else in a pick 5, would probably be as more of a C-type horse, would be Lady Subi. They gave her a chance on the turn back last time at Oaklawn, but she just had a pretty tough trip. She was in traffic, got checked pretty bad, dropped back to, I think, last in the field before making a run to get up a well-beaten third, but a third behind Mia Mischief in that carousel stakes at Oaklawn. So for me, it just comes down to the 2 morning line favorites. If I wanted to look for an alternative, it would be Lady Subi.
Yeah, Mia Mischief is a tough horse because she feels like one that I just get wrong so often because she doesn't always run those big speed figures, but when she does, they sort of come out of nowhere, and she's able to hold her form once she gets good, and we saw that last year when she followed up that big figure in the Humanidistaf with a race in the Roxelana when she beat Kofefi just after that, and that's around the same time of year that she's running now. She's a horse that definitely loves 6 furlongs. She loves Churchill Downs, and like you said, she's projected to work out a pretty good trip here because there's not that much speed signed on, and she's got that outside post position, so she should be just stalking break even like she was stalking, I believe, Amy's Challenge last time, and I just kind of see Mia Mischief rolling on by. Break even, she's pretty good. She ran some big speed figures as a 3-year-old last year. I guess you can view her last race at Oaklawn and say, oh, well, that's a sign that she's getting back on track. I don't want to say I was underwhelmed by that performance. I thought she did what she had to do, but she didn't quite show me that she's the same filly that she was last year. It turned out that even though that race was projected to feature a really fast pace, the pace just ended up being kind of moderate. It was a race where nobody made any kind of close from the back of the pack. It was just kind of a merry-go-round affair. It was also against much weaker company than what she's facing here. So to me, Break Even still has something to prove, and I don't think they're going to be as close in price as they are on the morning line. I think Mia Mischief is going to be a much heavier favorite than that. But to me, Mia Mischief is sort of the A horse to use in this sequence, and Break Even's more of a B type. As for the others, I have pretty much the same sentiments about some of the horses you mentioned. Spice Perfection, she does have back races going 6 furlongs that make her competitive here, but her recent form leaves a little to be desired. We have the same feelings about that Go for Wand. She moved a little bit too soon, that inside information last time, but she still should have held on a little bit better. She's coming out of Peter Miller's bar, and I believe she was a private purchase since earlier this winter. So there are just some question marks surrounding her, even though she is good enough to handle a field like this on her best day. The one other horse at a price that I would mention is the number 4, Bell's the One. She needs some pace to close into, and she might not get it here, but she did show some promise last year as a 3-year-old. I thought she ran really well to win that Raven Run 3-back. She was just in too tough in the La Brea behind Hard Not to Love and Bellafina after that, and then they tried the turf. On her best day, she can get a big piece of this. I don't know if she's good enough to beat Mia Mischief if that one shows up, but I think Bell's the One will be rolling late for at least a piece.
Yeah, she was the one other horse I had a note on to just keep an eye on. Not so much for today, but I think she's a talented filly, as you mentioned. I just think there's probably not enough speed, and that she might even prefer 7 furlongs. So I was kind of going to keep an eye on her for future races. But if the race were to somehow fall apart, I think she is the one you would want.
The second leg in this sequence is the 8th race on the card. It's a maiden special weight for the 3-year-olds and up, going a mile and a 16th on the dirt. And I think we're going to have a prohibitive favorite in this race in the number 9, Ashiham. He doesn't have a big edge over this field on speed figures, but he just kind of has that look to him of a horse that is supposed to continue improving with experience, supposed to keep getting better with added ground. He's certainly bred to handle the 2 turns at the very least. He was an expensive yearling purchase for Shadwell. Was with Kieran McLaughlin, now transferred to Todd Pletcher. Just seems like one that's going to keep moving in the right direction. I think it's a matter of how short of a price you want to take on a horse like this.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I first looked at this field, it's a full field of 12. We got 4 also eligibles. I think the temptation was to think, oh, it's a wide open race and let's try to spread and go deep. But I'm not sure that would be the right strategy in a race like this. I think when I actually dug through the PPs, there's only a few that I really think have a good shot to win. And I would start with Ashiham, obviously. I went and watched this replay. He looked good to me. He looked like a horse who wanted more distance, not just because he was closing late, but just the way it kind of took him a little more time to get into stride with that faster early pace of a sprint. I think he'll be able to settle earlier going long. And for me, he's clearly the one to beat. He would be an A on my tickets. The only others I really saw that I might consider using were the 3 Mau Mau for Bill Mott. Just second time out. He didn't run particularly well first out, but that's not a strength of Bill Mott's. He is bred to go this. It's not really a longer distance for him. It's the same distance, but I'm looking for a little improvement from him. So if somebody was going to upset, he'd be one. And the other one would be the 7-horse Bear Alley. So nothing real too exciting here. I think he is the second choice on the morning line, but he's a colt who's improved his TimeformUS speed figure every time out, and not just small improvements, pretty big jumps. Even did it last time on turf where he ran a career best 101. He moves back to the dirt. He's very likely going to be on or right near the lead. He might just be off a longer price than Oceanic. but I think he's going to get a good trip and be the one to run down. So those are the ones I'm interested in here.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar thought about this race. Initially, I thought it was pretty wide open. And then as I started to dig in a little bit more, there are really only a few horses that I want in this race, and you mentioned most of them. Ashiham, I really have nothing to add. I agree. When I watched that last race, it looks like he wanted more ground. He's just got this amazing pedigree, Wine Princess. She was a graded stakes winner routing on the dirt, I believe at Churchill Downs even. And she is a daughter of a Zeri. It's just a really nice dirt routing family. So he's likely to improve. Bear Alley, to me, if I had to make a top pick in this race, it would be Bear Alley, just for that pace advantage that you alluded to. I would imagine that Oceanic, that second-time starter, will go on to be aggressive in this race towards the front end, but when you look at the rest of this field, there are just so many plotters in this race, a lot of deep closers, and I could see a situation where Oceanic and Bear Alley just sort of sneak away on the front end, and I just trust Bear Alley to get the distance much more than I do Oceanic, who doesn't have a whole lot of route pedigree on the dam side. But Bear Alley, he's just been taking a step forward subtly with each start. He was in a tough maiden race 3 back when he was behind Palm Springs, but he was a little green that day, stayed on. Thought he took a nice step forward 2 back when he finished second to Jokare. He actually is a horse that he gets pretty aggressive in his races, and I think they did the right thing by him to start allowing him to go to the front end, because it seems like that really has gotten him to relax early in his last 2 starts. They tried the turf, and he actually has plenty of turf pedigree. He's a half to Arklow, as well as Murad, but he's by Will Take Charge, and it seems like he runs on the dirt just fine. So I just think given the trip he's likely to get, he's going to be the one to run down, as you said. We'll see if Ashiham can catch him. The horse that you mentioned as the third one, Mau Mau, he's a horse that I actually highlighted in that Horses to Watch segment that I do for DRF. His debut, he just kind of looked like a horse that needed a race. He was far back early, made a big wide looping move on the turn, and just really couldn't make up any ground in that short stretch run. But I highlighted him mostly because I assumed that Bill Mott was going to run him on turf next time out, because while he is bred to go longer, he does have a real turf pedigree on the dam side. His dam Tokyo Time was a good turf horse for Shug McGahee, and there's a lot of turf influences even in the second generation. So I'm just a little bit surprised that Bill Mott's giving him one more chance on the dirt. He is an empire maker, so maybe he can go either way. But he is one that has a right to take a step forward. The one other horse that I would just give a brief mention to, since he's likely to be a bigger price, is the number 1 Aztec Empire. He's a 4-year-old in this field, whereas we've been talking about a lot of 3-year-olds. We saw him at Oaklawn Park a few times. He ran pretty well 2 back in that sloppy track race behind Don Vito Corleone. He was off slowly that day, made a sustained move around the far turn up the rail to take the lead before fading at the end. His last race, I think some people might write him off based on the last race since it was so poor. I don't know what was going on that day. He again got off a little bit slowly. That's an issue for him, braking slowly. But after that, it just seemed like Joe Talamo got lost. He never really had him in a good spot. He didn't even really try to motivate him in the stretch. So I don't know what was going on that day. But he is a horse that has more tactical speed when he breaks cleanly, if he can. And I think on his best day, he just fits with these from a speed figure standpoint. So he'd be one that I think you might want to not let slip by at a big price.
Yeah, I could see him. I'm just a little leery of those Oaklawn horses. He's a horse who has somehow managed to finish behind Copper King several times, and we've discussed Copper King, who's still a maiden, has won over $100,000. So I can't put a whole lot of faith in him finding the winner's circle personally.
I know sometimes we have little vendettas against horses for silly reasons like that. I mean, in Copper King, as you said on Twitter, I think he's earned over $100,000 as a maiden. But if he were in this race, I think Copper King would be the fastest horse. It's just you would expect one of the others to take a step forward and beat him, since that's usually what happens. Let's move on to the middle race of this sequence, the 9th. It's a turf sprint, 5.5 furlongs, optional claiming event, also a non-winners of 2 other than for the fillies and mares. And this is a pretty interesting race. You've got a lot of contenders. The morning line favorite, interestingly enough, is the number 6 Binghua. And I think this is a horse that you sort of have to develop an opinion about if you're going to bet this sequence, because she is the kind of horse that I would typically be inclined to take a stand against, because her one turf race was just woefully slow, and it came against much weaker company at Batavia Park. On the other, or Belterra Park rather. On the other hand, she does have real pedigree to handle the turf, and Wesley Ward has sort of handled her like she might be a decent horse, and the fact that he's bringing her back on the turf here off a disappointing return at Turfway, and the fact also that he's connected with some horses at Churchill Downs so far this meet that I certainly haven't liked on paper that have taken money in the last week. That kind of opens my eyes to her as well. So I'm not going to make her my top pick in this race, but I'm not going to let her beat me in a pick 5 sequence.
Yeah, we have similar thinking. I don't love this horse, but you have to figure she's going to be dangerous. She's almost assured to get the early lead early, assuming she breaks okay. She should do so fairly easily. And it's just a matter if she's going to be able to hang on. And I don't want to get beat by that kind of horse if I'm playing a late pick 4 or a pick 5. So she'll be on my tickets, but she's not going to be my top pick. I don't really have any big knocks other than she hasn't run particularly fast. There's others in the field just as fast, and I never want to be keying on a favorite in that situation. A couple that I am interested in, I like the 5, I'll handle the cash. Last time out, that horse missed the break, got steady late, still ran a pretty nice figure for trainer Ray Handel, which I assume that's not an accident. They kind of cleverly worked his name into the horse's name. But yeah, she ran a 105 TimeformUS speed figure despite that tardy break, despite a little trouble late where she clearly kind of pulled up on full run. And I think she looks really good in here in that 10-1 morning line. She gets an extra half furlong over what she got at Gulfstream on what's going to be a more closer-friendly course than what we saw down there in Miami. So I'll handle the cash as one for me. Another that I like is the 11, Dixie Candyland. Just it's versatile, good tactical speed from the outside for Joel Rosario. Also has speed figures as good or better than the morning line favorite. And I like that she's third off the layoff, showed some improvement last time out. And she just really seems to always run well on turf. Her 2 stinkers have been on dirt, so she clearly likes the grass. And if there was one more I was going to mention, it would be the 8, Cardamon. Cardamon is a filly. She's never been on the turf before, but she does have a good family on that. She's a half to Emollient, who obviously did her most of her damage routing on the turf, but she did handle turf nevertheless. And she's also a half to the very good horse Hofberg, who we saw have a good 3-year-old season. He's been a little disappointing and hasn't tried turf, but he's one I was always hoping would try it just to see how he'd handle it, knowing he was related to Emollient. So Cardamon kind of interests me in this spot as well.
Yeah, if I had to make a top pick in this race, it would be I'll handle the cash. That 10-1 morning line seems like a dream to me. She should be the second choice in this race behind Binghua. Just to wrap up Binghua, she's actually a half sister to Bound for Nowhere, that very good turf sprinter for Wesley Ward. So I think it's interesting that Wesley Ward hasn't really targeted her at turf races, given that he trains the other horse and he certainly knows that they're related. Just kind of interesting that he's gone to dirt with her instead. Given that he knows that. But he's finally getting her on the turf here, so we'll see what she does. She should be in front, but I don't think that I'll handle the cash is going to be as far behind as she's been in some recent races. Her issue has been the gait. As you said, she broke slowly last time, and that's not something you want to do in these turf sprints, and that worries me a little bit because, again, even 2 back at Aqueduct, she wasn't as slowly away as she was at Gulfstream last time, but she wasn't the quickest out of the gate, and it's just put her behind the 8 ball in her last 2 starts, whereas prior to that, she had far more tactical speed. I will say that race at Aqueduct 2 back is also not as bad as it seems, because that was one of those Joel Rosario rides that just kind of leaves you saying, what was that after the race? Because I don't know what he was doing. It didn't look like he was trying to win the race, that's for sure. But I'll handle the cash. I think she's coming off 2 trips that weren't ideal, and she's likely to do better here if she's ready to go off the brief layoff. So I'm definitely using her. As for the others, I gave a look to Cardamon, who you mentioned. I don't love these horses going from dirt sprints to turf. She does have that pedigree, as you said, but it's really that pedigree to go longer. And for me, she was one of these last time with the time horses where I have no idea how she went off at 9-1 in that race at Oaklawn last time, because she looked like she should have been about 4-1 in that race, but she won at a price. And I don't know. To me, this is a tougher spot, and I just wasn't quite convinced that turf sprinting would be the answer for her. The other horse that I think is very interesting in this race is the number 10 Whimsical Muse, and she might be one that gets a little bit ignored in this spot because she's coming off some form that looks a little bit up and down, but let's keep in mind she's 2 for 2 on the turf, and both of those turf efforts have been solid. They asked her to go 7.5 furlongs around 2 turns the first time she tried it back in January. That just seemed like it was too far for her because she took that race over and just got leg weary late, like one that didn't really want to go that distance. But her last turf race, actually 2 starts back on March 12th at the fairgrounds, that race is worth a watch because she was visually impressive that day. She was in behind horses coming to the top of the stretch. James Graham had to squeeze her in between runners, but she went in that hole very willingly, and she really kicked away from that field impressively at the end, galloped out strongly. She closed into a slow pace that day, so it's not like she got some great trip. And to me, based on that one turf sprint, that puts her right in the mix here from a speed figure standpoint. She is stepping up in class, but I think we're going to get a bit of a price on her. So she's one of the main ones that I would use. So for me, the horses that I really want to focus on here are I'll Handle the Cash, Bingwa, and Whimsical Muse. The others are more B and C types to me if I'm going to use them at all. Dixie and Candyland, who you mentioned, I did give her a long look. My one issue is I remember handicapping that last race that she comes out of at Gulfstream Park. That was just a very weak race for the level. She was even money for a reason that day, and I just don't love her form prior to that. So to me, this is a much tougher spot, but she is a horse that's in good form right now, and I think you'd be remiss to just ignore horses that are in good form in these turf sprints.
I like how you mentioned Whimsical Muse as a horse that could get lost because in these big fields that we're seeing everywhere across the country, there are horses like that who it almost has to happen where there's going to be 1 or 2 that just kind of get lost in the shuffle and go off at much higher odds than they really should. And it's just something you got to keep an eye out for as a handicapper. Doesn't help you in the pick fives if you don't have access to the tote board, but when you're playing these races individually, it's something to take note of.
Let's move on to the 10th race, the penultimate race in this pick 5 sequence. It's an optional claiming. Nominers are 2 other than going 1 mile and 16th on the main track for the older colts and geldings and horses. And there's a horse in this race that I think we're going to agree, just based on raw talent, is the most talented runner in this field. That's the number 7, Fearless. He was pretty impressive last time, despite losing that race at Oaklawn Park as the even money favorite, because he just lost interest in the middle of the race, was much farther back than I think either of us would have ever anticipated, but he made a big late run through the final 3/8 of a mile of that race, kind of got it closer than you really would have expected he'd be able to, given where he started from coming around the far turn. A big price did win that race, but they ran a fast speed figure. And to me, if Fearless can get his act together finally, he's going to be tough for this field to beat. But you do have to be a little bit concerned that he's going to pull that act again this time.
Yeah, for sure. That was a really strange race last time. He's almost assured to be the favorite in this field. Everybody saw him absolutely flying through the stretch. I don't have the chart in front of me, but I remember looking at the GPS chart, and it was eye-catching how fast he ran. So take a look at that if you get a chance on the Equibase site to the people listening. But it was crazy. But he's a horse, I'll admit, I just don't know what to do with him. If it was a race I'm just playing vertically, he's one I would probably want to take a stand against, just hoping that he's not going to get his act together at a short price, and some signs are there that he won't because he's had a couple of disappointing efforts. But the horses who are 2nd and 3rd on the morning line aren't anything I'm too excited to try to beat them with. We have Top Speed and Gun It. Of those 2, I much prefer Gun at the top speed. Gun It has proven that he's at least a pretty fast horse. He's competitive. He's been competitive in stakes races. So he's obviously a quality animal, where Top Speed is a lightly raced horse for Shug McGahee. And at 3-1 on the morning line, I just don't see it. He's won 2 out of 3. He obviously romped in an allowance race at Tampa. But that was a really weak field where he only got 100 TimeformUS speed figure. I remember watching that race that day and looking forward to doing the figures that evening because I was thinking he probably ran a 115 or something visually, but it just didn't turn out to be the case. We did knock that 100 down a little from a 107 final time because the pace was so slow, but it's just hard for me to take a short price needing the horse to improve probably 15 points to be competitive. So I'm against Top Speed in here. Like I said, no real knocks on Gunnet. He's probably the most likely to beat Fearless if it's the same Fearless we saw last time who decides to take half the race off. And there's only one other horse in here that I'd really consider using, and that's the 4, Pluquet Parfait. He's a horse who was on the Derby Trail, actually ran in the Kentucky Derby, but we got to know him on the Derby Trail. He ran, I think he was a good second in one of the 2-year-old races at Kentucky. But he came off a layoff after the West Virginia Derby last year where he ran third. Pretty long layoff, and he didn't run particularly well in that race won by Harvey Wallbanger that we've talked about a few times. But he was up close to the pace that day, and even though the pace figures aren't red or even particularly fast, it was a race that just fell apart late. It was a really strange race. They put him back on turf next out, and he ran just okay. He was beaten 4 lengths, but he was never really a factor behind Largent that day. But I just think he's probably sitting on his best race. Now, whether it's good enough to beat horses like Fearlet or Gunnet, it's tough to say. But if I was looking for more of a price, he is the one I would go to.
Yeah, Fearless just has an ability edge on this field. I mean, he faced off against Gunnet in that New Orleans Classic that they both were in last time for Gunnet and 2 back for Fearless. And Fearless did not have a good trip that day. He had plenty of trouble, and he still finished 4 lengths ahead of Gunnet. So, I mean, Fearless, to me, if he shows up here, he's going to be tough to beat. And the thing that I think we have to talk about with this race is the pace, because what worked against Fearless last time is that they ended up going really fast up front, and he just got completely outrun because, as we've talked about in the past with him, he's not the quickest horse out of the gate, and it just seemed like he got lost in the early stages being so far back last time. And in this race, there's just not really much speed in here, and typically I'd be skeptical of a horse like Top Seed, who's stretching out for the first time, but I've got to think the Top Seed is just going to be pretty loose on the front end here because he's coming out of these sprint races. He obviously has the speed to be in front of these early, and typically I would just sort of dismiss a runner like this because he's been facing weaker horses. He hasn't run fast enough yet, but I'm not sure who's going to really go after him in the early going, so I just think he's dangerous. He's not my top pick by any means, and for me, he's more of a B or C type in multi-race sequences, but I'm not going to completely dismiss Top Seed just for that one reason about the pace. I'll be interested to see how they ride Gunnet in here, because I don't know why they've decided to take away Gunnet's speed in his recent races. I mean, if you watch the early portion of that New Orleans Classic, Gunnet certainly was wondering why they took away his speed too, because he was really fighting Ricardo Santana, who just seemed hell-bent on getting him off the pace, and Gunnet wanted to run up there, and they just wouldn't let him. Gunnet has run well towards the front end in the past, and from the outside post position here, I think Joel Rosario would be wise. Just let him go away from the gate, get forward position, perhaps stalking right outside of Top Seed, and I think that makes Gunnet pretty dangerous here. And for me, the 2 horses that I would really want to focus on are Gunnet and Fearless. Fearless is probably the more talented runner, but Gunnet, if they ride him correctly, is perhaps a little bit more trustworthy. He's not always the most trustworthy horse to finish off a race because, as we've mentioned many times with him, he's one of these horses that just refuses to change leads. I actually went back and watched almost all of his races to see if he's ever changed leads. He actually did it in his maiden victory back in 2018, but if you watch the stretch drive of that race, Ricardo Santana literally had to sort of pick him up off the ground and put him back down to get him to do it because he just did not want to change over to that right lead in the stretch. So that's always a concern for Gunnet, that he might get leg weary late. So for me, if I'm just talking about like ABC kind of stuff, Fearless is the A, Gunnet's the B, and maybe I use a few C's like Top Seed, and even that horse you mentioned, Pluquet Parfait, for all the reasons that you delineated. But for me, this is a pretty straightforward one.
And thanks for mentioning that it's Top Seed. I don't know why I was calling him Top Speed. Just got old eyes, I think.
Well, he might have top speed for the early stages of that race, so I think we'll expect him to be in front. Let's finish up this pick 5 sequence with the other stakes on this card. It's the grade 3 Mint Julep going 1.16 on the turf for the fillies and mares. And this one drew a pretty high quality field for a grade 3 event. We've got a couple of horses coming out of grade 1 races, actually, both of them drawn down towards the rail for the Brad Cox barn. The interesting thing about this race, though, that I want to let you talk about is the pace, because it's a pretty unusual situation for a 14-horse field.
I would imagine to have the no speed label in a 14-horse field, this has to be the first time it ever happened. Now, you could debate a few horses in here that maybe they should be labeled as more upfront types than what they've shown, but I don't think there's much argument that there's not a whole lot of speed in here. The one horse who I think is going to be the speed and is shown in front is the 14 Mitchell Road. She draws the far outside post, but the problem with her and the reason she's not shown as a speed horse is the last couple she's just had gait problems, hasn't gotten out cleanly, been near the back of the field, and she's hard to trust. Usually when you see that happening with horses, it's never a good sign when it happens a few times. Well, usually once you can excuse, but that second time is iffy. So, well, I think Mitchell Road can certainly be dangerous if she breaks cleanly. I'm not optimistic that it's something I would want to bet my dollars on that she's going to do, particularly since it's a stronger field anyway. And even if she did make the lead, I'm not positive she could hang on against fillies as talented, fillies and mares. But that said, it's a really tough race, and that most of the contenders that people, horses that people would label as contenders, are coming off of layoffs. Some of them pretty long layoffs. We have Juliet Foxtrot drawn inside, and Beau Recall just to her outside in the 2 posts, both for Brad Cox. They're both coming off like 6-month or longer layoffs. They're probably clearly the 2 class horses in the field, but you do have that layoff question, and is this grade 3 what they're really gunning for? I would tend to doubt it in both of their cases. You have a couple other horses, Nay Lady Nay for Chad Brown, who's also coming off a long layoff. She won the grade 2 Miss Revere over this same track last year. Chad Brown, certainly no knocks on him bringing horses off the layoff. He brings them back ready. And even Secret Mischief for Graham Motion is another one I would normally be interested in. And she also is coming off that long layoff. So there is a whole lot of ways you can go in here. And I'm curious to see which way you're leaning, David.
Yeah, just kind of starting with the pace where you began. Mitchell Road, I do think she'll be in front of this race because I would imagine that Joe Talamo is going to have to be aggressive with her from that outside post position. And I just want to clarify, she did break very slowly two back. And that really did her in that day as the heavy favorite. She actually broke fine last time in that fairgrounds race. Somebody bumped into her at the start, but she broke with the field alertly. And it just seemed like it was the plan that Joel Rosario was going to take her off the pace that day. He really reined her in right away and tried to let horses cross in front of them early. So they decided to rate her last time. I don't know why. But when she's running her best races, she's typically forwardly placed. My question with Mitchell Road, though, and we're talking about a 10-1 shot, but it's because of this no speed characterization, and she's the leader. But my question with her is she even good enough to win this race if she runs her race and has everything go her way? I'm not sure about that because when she's won races, she's typically beaten up on some softer competition. When they've tried her against tougher company, she often hasn't quite gotten it done. So I'm just skeptical that Mitchell Road is good enough to win this race, but I would use her defensively because of that possible pace advantage. I do think Juliet Foxtrot is just the right horse in this race. She's going to get a good trip as long as she breaks alertly from the rail. She's got tactical speed to be in good position. 1.16 it's a fine distance for her. Maybe a mile's a little bit better, but she can certainly get the 1.16. People will see that she sort of blew leads in the stretch of her last two races, but to me that had everything to do with the pace of each of those races. They just went so fast up front in that first Lady two back, and she actually ran really well to be second that day, well ahead of the rest of the field behind Uni. And then last time in that matriarch, the pace wasn't as fast as it was in the First Lady, But again, she made that early move to the lead, got run over by two horses that came from farther back in the pack, Got Stormy and Daddy is a Legend, both of whom are very good and would be favorites in this race in their own rights. So I just think Juliet Foxtrot is the right horse in this race. She'll likely be the favorite, but in a pick 5 sequence, she'd be one that I would lean on a little bit and then spread a lot more behind her with like B and C type horses. Brad Cox's other horse, Beau Recall, on her best day, she's arguably as good as Juliet Foxtrot. It's just, you've got to question, how are these deep closers going to do in a race with not a lot of speed? She did draw a good post down towards the inside, and I don't think she wanted any part of a mile and a quarter last time, so getting back to a mile and the 16th is good for her. We'll just see if the trip works out, and there are some other horses that'll be bigger prices that are also going to be closing. I'm not the biggest fan of Nay Lady Nay, who's probably also going to be a short price in this race. To me, she had everything work out with her trip last time, that Mrs. Revere. That was over a boggy course. She's going to be over a much firmer turf course this time. She can improve now, going from 3 years old to 4 years old. I just kind of want to see her do it. So to me, she's one that I would use more as like a C type. Secret Message, who you mentioned, I think she's very interesting because she is a bit dirtied up off her prior performances where the pace just didn't work out at all. She's not going to get pace in this race either, but she's going to be a much bigger price than those two closers that I just mentioned. The one other horse that I'd want to use in this race as sort of a B type of runner is the number 11 Zofel. She's coming from another one that comes from well off the pace, but the trips just didn't work out in her last two races. She was very wide, 2 back in that Alston Memorial, won by She's on the Warpath. That winner saved a lot of ground that day, and Zofel just went about 5 wide around the turn on a racetrack where you really wanted to be down towards the inside. And then last time out in that Gulfstream race, it wasn't the fastest stakes that you'll see when La Signari only got a 106 TimeformUS speed figure to win that affair. But Zofel was arguably best that day because she was bottled up inside for the beginning of the stretch run. Joelle just had to wait a bit too long to make that move with her. So I think she's better than her speed figures make her look. It's just a matter of whether or not the trip works out.
Yeah, I just found this a really tough race. I don't have any problem with anybody. I will definitely be spreading in here. I'm with you. I think Juliet Foxtrot is probably the horse to beat. I'm a little leery of Brad Cox off the layoff. It's not his strongest suit. He's overall on our TimeformUS ratings. He's a guy who's pretty much 100 all the time as one of the top trainers out there. But his layoff stats just aren't as good. They're an 84 if you just look at the two horses in here. It's not terrible by any means. He certainly wins off the layoff, but it's just not a strong point of his. So that's if these horses had been running or he was a really good layoff trainer, I might even consider her a single. But I will spread in this race with the horses that we've mentioned.
And just to sum up, to mention pick 5 strategy for this race, I keep talking about A, B, and C horses. I'm obviously referencing the ABC method of playing these multi-race sequences that Steve Christ has written about quite a bit. And this is one of those sequences where it's really tough, but my A ticket would be really thin, or my all A's ticket. I would probably just have one A in every race in this sequence, except maybe that 8th race, the maiden event, where I would use 2, Ashiham and Bear Alley. But in the other races, I would just have one A, Mia Mischief, Fearless, Juliet Foxtrot, and I'm sorry, in that 10th race, I'd also have a few. I'll Handle the Cash and Bingwa, as well as that Tom Amos horse. But I would keep that A's ticket pretty thin and then try to get most of those home. And maybe if I get one of the B's or C's home, other races in the mix, it'll work out that I can still hit it.
That's good. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's something I actually need to brush up on. I've always been more of a vertical type player. I like to play them one race at a time. I'm personally much too anti-favorite when I play horizontal bets. It's something I'm working to get better where I just toss favorites and wind up going 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 4 and get beat by a 7-5, which there's really no reason to do that if it's going to pay well. So that's something I need to brush up on, and I have to get my Steve Chris books out and give them a read.
Yeah, I mean, not to spend too much time on it because we've got a couple more races to handicap, but something that I've learned with playing these multi-race sequences is it's more important to stay alive than to try to take a big stand sometimes. You could take a big stand in the win pool or when you're playing doubles, but in these multi-race sequences, If I really don't like a horse and think that a favorite doesn't have a chance, that's a different story. I'm not going to use that horse. But if I'm sort of iffy on a horse like Binghua, who we talked about, typically she'd be a horse that if I was playing win wagers or exactas in the race, I would take a bit of a stand against her and try to get some others home at bigger prices. But I'm afraid of her, so I don't want to let her beat me in a pick 5 sequence if I can be right in the other legs.
Right, and let me ask you, I would assume you don't want to use a ticket where you're going to have a bunch of those horses win. If a bunch of horses like her win, I assume you're not going to cash, but you're kind of defensively using her so that, you can cash if you're right on the other races.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm done with putting the wager together, one of the questions I like to ask myself is, okay, which horses are my money really going through? And some people just like to single a horse in a race, which if you're playing a caveman ticket, that's often how it works out. And sometimes you're singling a horse and playing $100 ticket, and to me, that's just sort of $100 win bet on that one horse that you're singling. And obviously you're getting a much bigger price because you'll be hitting it in a multi-race sequence. But I like to sort of spread out a little bit more. And maybe a horse like Binghua, who I think is a good example to use in this situation, maybe, 25% of my play might be going through her. And do I think that she's 25% to win the race? Maybe about that. I think that's fair. So that makes sense to me. She's not a horse that I love. She's not a horse that I want to bet to win. But she's a horse that I want to have a significant portion of my play go through because she's one that I want to have help me get alive. Let's move on to those 2 California Stakes races that I mentioned at the top of the show. One is at Santa Anita, one's at Golden Gate. The Santa Anita Stakes race on Saturday is the Grade 3 Honeymoon. It's going 1 1/8 for the 3-year-old fillies on the turf. And you've got a bunch of horses coming out of that China Doll Stakes. It was a big field that day, and the one that's likely to take the most money coming out of that affair is the number 9, Stella Star. She made a big looping move from the back of the pack to get up for second in her first race in this country. If she runs another race like that, I kind of do think she is the horse to beat in here.
Yeah, I think she's clearly the horse to beat. But figure-wise, this is a race that's pretty even, top to bottom. I think there's a lot of ways you can go. Of the 2 favorites, I do much prefer Stella Star to the 5 Laura's Light. That one, I believe, is the second choice on the morning line. But that's one I think 9 furlongs is really pushing it for her. She's won sprinting, going 5.5. She's won at a mile, but she just doesn't seem like 1 1/8 horse to me. So of those 2, I'm definitely going to lean on the favorite Stella Star. There is another horse that interests me in here, and it's a price horse, and that's the 6 Little Bird. When I was looking at that race, I almost caught her trip by accident. It just said there were several horses in here. And her trip comment in the chart makes no mention of it whatsoever. But I actually think this is a filly that had some pretty significant trouble. She got checked on the back stretch, actually had to drop all the way back to last, was kind of making a nice run through the stretch, and just had nowhere else to go. So she's actually the horse I'm going to focus in on here on my tickets and vertical bets. I'm going to try to get her in the money with some logical horses like Stella Star. She's trained by my favorite turf trainer out there, Richard Baltus. So I'm not really counting on the 15-1, but given her morning line, I do think she'll given her PPs, I think she'll be in that 10-1 range. So her and Stella Star are the 2 for me that I'm really going to lean on heavy vertically in this race and horizontally if I decide to get involved that way.
Yeah, that China Doll is a very interesting race to watch from a trip standpoint because you've got 5 horses coming out of the China Doll that are back in this race, and Stella Star is obviously the one that had the most eye-catching trip because she was moving fastest at the end of the race, but there are some other horses in this field that didn't have the best go of it. I agree with what you said about Little Bird, that she was really just not in a good spot for much of that race. I couldn't tell if she was a horse that was in the wrong spot and still had no run, or if she was a horse that was in the wrong spot and did have run. I just couldn't quite make it out. If she did have run, then she's very interesting in this race at a price. I just wasn't sure which way it went. It was hard for me to tell from the video. The horse that I would take out of that China Doll at a bigger price is the number 7 Red Lark. She didn't have the worst trip. She was towards the inside for much of the race, but she was a little bit ahead of Little Bird through the stretch. And I just thought you wanted to be rallying outside because you were in the clear. I mean, a horse like Stella Star did have to lose ground on the turn to get there. But Red Lark, it just looked like she didn't quite have the turn of foot to quicken through some holes down on the inside, going that mile distance. I do think getting back out to the 1.125 is going to be pretty significant for a lot of horses in here because most of them haven't gone this far yet. Red Lark has gone the 1.125. She actually broke her maiden doing that two back. It's interesting. Red Lark and Stella Star, daughters of this sire Epaulet, who I'm not familiar with at all. I guess he was a horse that raced in Australia, but that's just a kind of a funny coincidence here. But I do think that Red Lark is a horse that will be okay going this longer distance, and maybe she can grind them down or get a bigger piece of this. If they go quickly up front, because you've got to wonder about what's going to happen on the front end, because you've got two speed horses in this race, Laura's Light and Parkour, who both do their best racing on the front end. Parkour let Laura's Light go when they met in that Blue Norther two back, but I don't think that's going to happen here because Mike Smith is back on Parkour and she just ran them off their feet in an allowance race last time, so I think Mike Smith is probably going to do the same thing again here. I just think even though there are only two speeds and we're not predicting a fast pace, going the 1.125, something's going to have to give on the front end.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And that's why I was against the second and third choices in here. I didn't even mention Parkour, but they certainly seem like the two to me that are the kind that are going to do each other in. And I don't even know if they're good enough anyway at this distance, even if they were left alone. So I'm with you. I do think Stella Star is going to run big. I have no problem whatsoever with Red Lark. I am going to use Little Bird. And, I think this is a fascinating race for handicappers. It's one you're going to have to watch the board because I think there might be some surprises. First, I'll be very surprised if Laura's Late's as low as 5-2. I think she'll probably go up a little bit higher than that, maybe even Parkour. So it's one where, you base your opinions on the morning line, but you better be flexible because I'm not sure it's going to play out the way it shows on the paper.
And let's finish things up at Golden Gate, another racetrack out in California up north. This is another turf race, but it's actually going just the 5.5 furlong distance. It's the Camilla Urso Stakes. And this is a pretty interesting race because at Golden Gate, you've got a lot of these horses that race primarily on the synthetic track. They don't often try the turf that much, especially in the lower level races. So you've got a lot of horses making that synth to turf move here, and you sort of have to look at the pedigrees a little bit, read between the lines of their form to determine who's going to really handle the situation.
Yeah, I do want to mention it is just 5 furlongs. They don't run 5.5 at Golden Gate. I don't think they can accommodate that. It's a 10 horse field. That's all that they allow in the gate. There's 4 AEs in here. And surprisingly, for a 5 furlong race, there's not a ton of speed in the TimeformUS running styles. We just have one each of leader, speed, and tracker. Normally, I would be drawn to a horse like the 3 I'm a Happy Cat. Was second in this race last year, dueled through really fast fractions before being passed late. But I think the 8 horse on the outside, Red Livy, is a horse who's going to cause her all kind of problems. She's a horse who there are speed horses, and then there are horses like Red Livy. She's actually been first at the first 2 calls of her last 9 races, which is something you're not going to see a whole lot on paper. No matter whose PPs you look at, it's just tough to do, particularly in horses that are sprinting all the time. Just a misstep at the break or something can set them back. But this horse just always gets to the front. So I think she's going to be problems for I'm Happy Cat. I don't think she's good enough to win this race, but I do think she's a major pace presence in here. So because of that, I decided to look at a couple other horses in here. And I think, unfortunately, I'm going to land on some shorter prices, namely Storming Lady, the Southern California shipper. She's a horse who just looks the fastest on paper to me, given that early speed in here. I think she's going to get a pretty good trip, probably sitting just a few lengths off the lead, but she's proven she can even sit back in 4th, 5th, 6th, no problem, and win races. So I think she's clearly the horse to beat, given the setup. The other one that I would tend to look at is Fantasy Heat, another Southern California shipper who's done very well at this short 5 furlong distance. She also has tactical speed, but doesn't need the lead. Not quite as high on this one because she's coming off that long layoff. It's not a strong suit for trainer Mark Glatt. So of the two, I much prefer Storming Lady, but the Southern Cal horses for me, I think just have a class edge and they should get a nice setup in here.
Yeah, for me, we totally agree on that favorite, Storming Lady. She's probably going to be a shorter price than that 4-1 morning line, and she's just way the horse to beat in this race because those optional claiming events down at Santa Anita, they're pretty tough, and I think that form is going to translate very well to this listed stakes up north. So for me, she's the horse to beat, but I would use a couple of price runners with her, and I'm actually pretty interested in that speed horse that you mentioned, the number 8 Red Livy. There is a question about her class, but sometimes in these turf sprints, especially the 5 furlong turf sprints, class seems to matter a little bit less, and just raw speed seems to be really important. And there's a scenario where Red Livy just gets in front of that one pace rival, the number 3 I'm a Happy Cat, in the early going, because I'm a Happy Cat, she's really more of a synth dirt kind of horse, and she did duel for the lead in this exact race last year on the turf. That was actually her only ever turf start, but she's sort of an unproven turf sprinter. And Red Livy, you know what her game plan's going to be. She's going out to the front. So I think she's dangerous because, I mean, she's tried this distance a number of times, and 3 of her lifetime's wins have come going this 5 furlong distance. They've actually all been at Golden Gate, where she's 3 for 3, going 5 furlongs on the turf here. So I think she's a real threat to wire this field, and she'll be a price in this race. The other horse that I want to use is the number 1 Tomlin. She's got speed figures that put her right in the mix. They're just on synth and dirt, but she just had no chance in that Desert Stormer last time behind Bellafina. She's getting back to a more realistic spot here, and I think she deserves another chance on the turf because her one prior turf effort was going 2 turns in a 1 mile race. That just doesn't seem to be what she's really good at. She's definitely more of a sprinting type. So I think her getting a chance to sprint on turf for the first time is going to be significant. And she's a half sister to a horse named Strike It Rich, who was a multiple stakes winner on the turf. So there is real pedigree for her to be okay on this surface. And she's got synthetic speed figures that put her right in the mix with a horse like Storming Lady. So to me, she's interesting from just off the pace.
Yeah, I have no problem with Tomlin. I was actually going to ask you about her and her breeding, knowing that she had been on it once, but hadn't sprinted on it, and I have no problem with using her. I would probably use your Red Livy in horizontals if I play them, just as we talked about earlier. You don't want to get knocked out by a horse who you know is going to be right up front in a 5 furlong race. So just one of those. I think it's an interesting betting race. There's going to be a lot of prices, and I don't blame anybody for taking a shot against Storming Lady. It's just another one where you got to monitor. If Storming Lady's 8-5, I don't want any parts of her. If she was 4-1, which isn't going to happen, I'd be all over her. But she would be my top pick. But I have no problem with Tomlin or any of the other horses you mentioned. It's wide open 5 furlong turf race, and they're getting more popular in this country. And personally, I love them, so I wish we'd see more of them.
Yeah, they're definitely interesting races to handicap because class seems to matter a little bit less, and trips are so important, just speed is so important. Really interesting races to dive into as a handicapper. So that's where we'll end things this week. We'll obviously be back to do our typical schedule next week with the TimeformUS Pacecast. I think there'll be enough stakes racing to recap that we can do one of those. And with these stacked cards at Churchill Downs and other places, I think there'll be some other races to talk about as well in the maiden and allowance ranks. So stay tuned for that. Remember, in the meantime, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with the TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.